Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Dr. Alistair Reid, and I'm the Executive Director of the Resolve Network and a Senior Expert for the Program on Violent Extremism at the United States Institute of Peace. I'd like to welcome everyone to the first event in the 7th Annual Resolve Global Forum series and say a bit about Resolve's work and introduce today's event. For those of you who are new to Resolve, the Resolve Network is a global consortium of researchers, research organizations, policymakers and practitioners housed at USIP. Resolve is committed to better research, informed practice and improved policy on violent extremism. Our research initiatives, which span thematic and geographical areas, include commissioned original research, capacity building efforts and convenings to provide key insights on specific aspects of violent extremism, badgering violent extremism, research, policy and practice. For more of our work, please visit our website and follow us on Twitter. Today's event discusses questions and themes that emerged from Resolve's long-running community-based armed groups project, or CBAGs for short, conducted in partnership with USAID's Africa Bureau's Office of Sustainable Development. We're very grateful for their continued support and funding on this important topic, which has enabled us to conduct extensive research, including multiple field research case studies across sub-Saharan Africa. CBAGs often emerge in fragile or conflict-affected regions, where official security actors are perceived as problematic or ineffective, providing their own brand of justice and security with varying degrees of popular support. Our research has explored the types and forms of CBAGs, as well as examining the factors that drive their creation and evolution in sub-Saharan Africa. Through fieldwork and case studies that we've commissioned, we've investigated the role that CBAGs play in the complex conflict ecosystems in which they exist, and seen how they are key actors in local peace and security, which can have both positive and negative implications. Furthermore, we apply the gender lens and research women's engagements with CBAGs, including their roles and motivations. However, as we reach the end phase of this project, we seek to explore the roots out of violence for CBAGs and their members. Whilst in recent years we've seen many programs aimed at disengaging violent extremists, helping them to reconcile their communities, however, there's been much less attention given to how former members exit CBAGs. What we wanted to ask in today's event is, are such disengagement and reconciliation programs suitable for CBAGs? If so, what lessons can we learn and how might they differ? Before we start, some general housekeeping. The event will start off with some brief presentations, followed by a moderate discussion before providing an opportunity for you, the audience, to ask your own questions through a moderated Q&A. We encourage you to ask questions to the speakers. You can submit your questions on the USIP event page, where you're watching this webcast, on USIP's YouTube, or on Twitter using the hashtag #ResolveForum. The session's moderator will incorporate some of the questions into the broader conversation with the speakers. As a reminder, this event is on the record and will be available on USIP's YouTube afterwards. Without much further ado, I'm honoured to introduce today's moderator, Dr. Mary Beth Altier, Research Advisory Council and a Clinical Associate Professor at New York University's Center for Global Affairs, where she directs the Master's Degree Concentration on Transnational Security and the Initiative on Emerging Threats. She has over 10 years' experience researching disengagement and re-engagement of violent extremists and has recently published a review of the lessons from 30 years of literature on DDR with the Resolve Network. Before handing over to Mary Beth, on behalf of USIP and Resolve, thank you again. We look forward to an insightful conversation.
Thank you, Alistair. Good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to be here with two incredible experts to discuss whether what we know about disengagement and reconciliation approaches for violent extremists and ex-combatants in the context of DDR would apply to community-based armed groups, or what we call CBAGs. So before we begin, I just want to introduce our panelists. So first we have Kamina Diallo. She's an expert on gender and international security and a PhD candidate at Sciences Po, where she received her undergraduate degree in international affairs. Ms. Diallo was a consultant at Deloitte for the public sector in Africa before joining a transnational research team based in Dakar, working on the bureaucratization of African societies. In 2020, she worked for the United Nations on the theme of gender mainstreaming on the 20th anniversary of the Women, Peace, and Security Agenda. She has published several articles and studies on women in the security sector in Côte d'Ivoire and on the impacts of post-crisis programs on Ivorian ex-combatants, the subject of her doctoral thesis. I'm also excited to introduce you to Lauren Van Meter. She is the Director of Peace, Climate, and Democratic Resilience at the National Democratic Institute. She's a peace and security expert, having worked on major diplomatic initiatives and peace and conflict resolution processes at the Pentagon, the State Department, the United States Institute of Peace, and the Atlantic Council. She joined NDI in 2018 and in 2022 was asked to lead the Institute's Peace, Climate, and Democratic Resilience Division, which will develop innovative democracy and governance approaches to some of democracy's major challenges. Dr. Van Meter is a leading expert on community and democratic resilience, having conducted research and led field initiatives on building the strength and capacity of communities and governments to resist different forms of shock, such as violent extremism, hybrid warfare, and environmental degradation. All right, so I wanted to begin with Lauren. Lauren, the formal CBAGs project, which was launched in 2018, as Alistair mentioned, is coming to a close. Can you tell the audience a little bit about the background of this project, the motivations for it, and exactly what a community-based armed group is? So how does that extremist organization or ex-combatants in the context of civil war?
Thank you, Mary Beth, and thank you to the Resolve team. It's really been a privilege to have been a part of the launch of the Resolve Network's Community-Based Armed Groups project at the beginning, 4 years ago in 2018, and today in one of its final sessions. I really want to compliment the Resolve team on launching this initiative because I think one of the important reasons that it was launched was to provide an extremely nuanced perspective on the impacts of violent extremism on local conflict dynamics, how the arrival of VE groups and international response networks, our own responses, were igniting, transforming, realigning local security arrangements, including among community-based armed groups. Resolve really successfully moved the security community away from this extremely narrow perspective on local security to widen the aperture so that we could all see how communities, women and men, civil society, and community-based armed groups were responding to the new security dynamics. I think one of the other important accomplishments of Resolve, and one of the reasons for its beginning, was employing local researchers and connecting them with noted experts so that we could not only understand the local conflict dynamics and make sense of them, but in the process advance thinking more broadly on a whole range of issues. Localization, which is so important to peace building right now, gender in armed groups, and security sector reform. So to kick off this discussion, I have been asked to, in many ways, do a tutorial on the difference between non-state armed groups, such as violent extremist groups or rebel and insurgent groups, which is really important for today's discussion on whether reintegration and demobilization efforts apply to community-based armed groups. So in thinking about community-based armed groups and how they're different from these other non-state actors groups, I'm going to hit you all with 4 points. First is that while community-based armed groups are a subset of non-state armed groups, unlike insurgent or terrorist groups, they don't seek to disrupt or undermine the state in order to establish an alternative political system. They really advance the local ambitions of their stakeholders. So they're very locally rooted organizations, with their stakeholders being the state, community leaders, formal or informal government institutions. In general, they're sort of status quo seekers. They're not revolutionaries. Second, community-based groups are extremely fluid organizations. They can start as hunter groups, they can morph into community or ethnic militias, they can then be deputized to serve with the military, or they can form alliances with insurgent groups. They're generally not motivated by political ideologies or worldviews, but by external shifts in the political security environment, which explains their fluidity, this response to these shocks and emerging trends. I think another important factor for the discussion of CBAGs is how they use violence and how they act as governance actors. Some CBAGs negotiate how and when they use violence with local or national stakeholders. This is sort of a spectrum. They use violence. Their use of violence is rooted in socially accepted norms in the community, and they may use it more discriminately and protectively, such as self-defense groups. So that's one end of the spectrum. Other CBAGs use violence more coercively and indiscriminately, often to advance their own material interests. And this, on the other end of the spectrum, these more malign groups are gangs or vigilante groups. The other important factor for purposes of our discussion today is the different roles that CBAGs can play in their communities in terms of governance. They can administer justice, they provide social services, and they can even play governance and political roles. And how CBAGs use violence and how they govern is absolutely critical for the discussion today on how they should be demobilized and reintegrated into communities. After all, how they use violence and against whom is going to impact discussions around demobilization and integration. And their role as governance actors will also be a critical factor as they transition from armed groups to civilian life. With that, Mary Beth, I will turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Lauren. That was a great overview. Okay, so shifting to Kamina. Kamina, can you tell us a little bit, drawing on your own research and experience, how individuals disengage from CBAGs, and just a little bit about what you've observed with these groups, particularly I know in Côte d'Ivoire, you've been working on them. So what does that process of disengagement look like for them, and what are some of the common drivers of disengagement in that DDR process?
Yes, first of all, I would like to thank the Reserve Network for the invite. It's always a pleasure and always interesting to learn more about CBAGs. I've been working on female and male participation in non-state armed groups, including on community-based armed groups in Côte d'Ivoire since 2014. And this really quick presentation is based on fieldwork that have been carried out since 2014 in three cities in Abidjan. In Abidjan, Bouaké, which was the headquarters of the rebel groups, and in Korogo, which is another city from the north of Côte d'Ivoire. It's really, I preface that because my main focus is on the rebels. And within these groups, there were a subgroup, as Lauren explained, which were the traditional hunters. And those traditional hunters, called Dozo, for the case of Côte d'Ivoire, some Dozo individually joined the rebellion during also. Joined the crisis, joined the rebel groups, and within the rebellion, there were some units made of Dozo, and those units were also composed with women. So just to give you the big picture. So basically, based on my research on female and male ex-combatants from non-state actors, and which includes, of course, CBAGs, what we can say is that CBAGs members' disengagement is really similar to, in many points, to their counterparts ex-combatants from non-state armed groups in Côte d'Ivoire. What I've been working on is that there have been three main paths for disengagement in Côte d'Ivoire. The first one is that some former CBAGs members were integrated into the official security and administrative apparatus, either as soldiers or as civil servants. This was made during the post-conflict era, and there were two main waves. One was after 2007, because after 2007 there were an agreement between the rebellion and the states, and they integrated more than 8,000 ex-combatants, including some DOZO, into the army. The other group is the second wave is made of ex-combatants which joined the rebellion after the post-electoral crisis in 2011. And just another precision maybe is that in 2017 there were a mutiny in Côte d'Ivoire made by those 8,000 soldiers in ex-combatants who were integrated within the army. So they still have a really important role within the states, either as a threat or as protectors. We can talk about it later on if you want to. So I've been talking about the first path, which was the fact that some of them were able to join the army. The other path was the fact that some of them reintegrated the community without going through DDR processes. So we can call it self-disengagement and self-reintegration. There were some of them, so those of them who self-reintegrate, some just went back to other activities as traders, herders, drivers of moto taxi, and so on. And some other they were they joined some association of DOZO, for instance, and they continue to work in security sector. We will focus on them later on if you have a little bit more time, or we can discuss about them later. And so, yes, for those who stayed in the security sector through those associations, they are still trying to negotiate their role as a security auxiliary with the states, with relative success. And the last path I would like to highlight is those who joined the DDR process, the national DDR process, mainly voluntarily. There are many programs of DDR organized during the crisis in Côte d'Ivoire, but I've been working on two main of them, the more successful, if I can say. And so those, in this case, they were supported by the programs created to create income generating activities. So some of them were working as motor taxi drivers, traders, chicken farmers, pig farmers, builders, and so on. What we can say is that within the subgroups, those who joined the DDR process, there are those three subgroups, those for whom the plain DDR activities worked. So their activities is flourishing and they are satisfied with the DDR process and the fact of joining the DDR process. And those for whom it didn't work, if I can say. And in this context, some of them have switched to other activities or have returned to their former activities, sometimes as traders, herders, and so on. And there is a third group, and this is on this group that I'm really working on. They decide to organize themselves as associations of ex-combatants, and they are mobilizing to obtain more money from the state or to obtain a job, are and also they are mobilizing to gain recognition from the state. If I may, I'd like to give some details on female combatants within this framework. In Côte d'Ivoire, as part of the post-conflict process, women who joined the armed groups were considered as ex-combatants on the same basis as men, which is not the case in all DDR process. So it's always interesting to precise that. In the context of DDR, there were, as I said, many veterans associations which were created, and there were also female veterans association which has been created in this framework. And the women I've been working with, I can divide them between two groups. There were some women who joined the army or the paramilitary corps, and they are pretty satisfied with the post-conflict era. And there are some other women who joined the DDR process who self-demobilized, and they benefit from income-generating activities. Most of the time, those of the women who benefited from income-generating activities had lower satisfaction than those who joined the army or the paramilitary corps, for many reasons that I can detail later on. Another point I would like to emphasize is that it should also be noted that during our investigation, we had the opportunity to meet some women who were considered as ex-combatants, or some men as well, but who had not belonged to any armed groups. According to some DDR staff members, some women who had never been members of armed groups had bribed warlords to have their names included on lists provided by DDR as part of the profiling of ex-combatants. So I just wanted to highlight the fact that corruption is also part of all those processes. And sometimes if you are not within the network, you can't join the official DDR process. And it's also the reason why some of them decide to self-disengage or and to go back within the community directly. It's really important. Another important fact that I wanted to highlight is about the DOZO. As I said, I've been working on the DOZO as a subgroup, but it was really interesting because the DOZO were, how can I say that? They were organizing into association way before the crisis. Some other decided to recreate or create new associations after the crisis to stay and to continue to work within the security sector as auxiliary, but also they decided to create those associations to gain money, because while they are working within the security sector, it's a way for them to gain some money. So what we can say is that whether or not they are going through the DDR process, some other engage in many activities that are still linked to the security sector. And while the state encouraged to disengage from the rebel groups through DDR, for instance, some members of CBAGs especially the DOZO, want to stay in the security sector for many reasons. As I said, money, security aspect, because their community still need protection, especially in the rural areas, and they consider also it's the protection of the community as their ancestral role. So this is also the reason why they try to stay within the security sector, and so for this reason, most of the members of CBAGs I've been working with, they are, for me, partly and they partly disengage because they try to stay within the security sector in some but as in a tricky way, if I can say, and their mobilization within association is also a way for them to stay within this sector. Thank you.
Thank you, Camina. That was wonderful. Such rich information, really, really enlightening. So wonderful to hear about your research and your experience there. So I wanted to ask, it does seem that disengagement and reconciliation and reintegration approaches make sense in certain contexts. And Lauren, you talked about, when you give us an overview of CBAGs, you talked about groups that, are coercive in their use of violence and groups that have a more negotiated use of violence with the community. So I wanted to ask both of you, you can feel free to chime in, in what context do you think these approaches are useful, or how are they useful? And also, might we need different approaches? I mean, CBAGs seem to comprise so many different types of groups. So, Lauren, you mentioned gangs. Like, do we actually want to reintegrate gangs in the military? No. So, it depends on these groups, I think, and whether they're predatory or more based in the community. So any insights on, one, do we need these approaches, or in which contexts are certain approaches more appropriate? Lauren, do you want to kick us off?
Sure, Mary Beth, and I think you raise a great point, which has often been problematic in terms of thinking about CBAGs and reintegration and disengagement, which is that we often make certain assumptions around community-based armed groups and apply them to the entire group, or panoply of groups, and I think that is really hurt our efforts to help CBAGs make this transition. I think I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the assumptions that we make about CBAGs and what that's meant in terms of some really, really problematic interventions and some really disastrous results in terms of engagement in CBAG transition. I think one of the early and really faulty assumptions that really needs to be addressed, and it was fascinating to listen to Camilla's presentation to see a little bit of the advancement in Côte d'Ivoire in terms of engagement with community-based armed groups, which in many ways historically has not been there. There's often been the assumption that community-based armed groups in a way don't need this sort of DDR engagement or this transition engagement in the same way that insurgent groups or rebel groups do, who are more threats to the state. And there's this sort of assumption that communities, CBAGs don't need reintegration because they will simply melt back into the communities that they came from. So I think that's been a poor assumption. And we saw from Camina's presentation that community-based armed groups are actually made up of many different layers of groups. So while we have originally begun to take on community security tasks, they then may evolve into community security providers. They may negotiate new relationships with the state and other insurgent groups. And then in that process, they become fundamentally different organizations. You saw this with the Civilian Defense Forces in Sierra Leone. You saw it earlier in Cote d'Ivoire, with the Bankati movement, which is that you began to see many different layers of groups interacting on these traditional hunter and security protective groups. When that happens, that is when you have sort of in many ways the danger of coercive versus more negotiated violence. You see that these new recruits often don't come from the same community traditions. They don't share the same social norms around violence. You begin to see that these recruits are given very quick introductions to the social and cultural norms of the group, not years of the socialization of the original members. You begin to see as these CBAG roles and responsibilities expand, that they become detached from the communities. They're deployed to other parts of the country. Their social and community norms are replaced by state interests, and norms around the views of violence change. So I think it's very important, as Kamina has laid out, that you think of CBAGs as not don't make assumptions about who they are as a group, that they are in groups for very, very different reasons, economic reasons, protective reasons, and then normative reasons. In many cases, these more layered elements of CBAGs, the ones that join later, that are engaged in coercive violence, the ones that are unmoored from their communities, are the ones that are often not engaged in DDR or transformation processes. And we see there, as we did in Sierra Leone, that these often become the criminal elements within the communities. We saw them move into the diamond trade in Sierra Leone and Cote d'Ivoire. Historically, they contributed to growing civil violence coming out of the coups and election contestation. I think the other thing that I'd like to address, which Kamina is so eloquently addressed as well, is that often the impulse here, which was tried in Cote d'Ivoire, is to integrate community-based armed groups into the armed forces. And I think that can be done for many reasons. Number one is just to establish oversight over groups that could potentially be a threat to the state. But there may also be a more positive impulse on the side of international groups to really integrate into the armed forces groups that are more responsive, as community-based armed groups can be, to citizen and community interest in security and definitions around security. But I think Kamina has actually pointed out the danger in that, which is that armed forces are nest beds of nepotism, patrimonialism, factionalization, and exclusion. And we see the danger here that integration of community-based armed groups only contributes that sort of factionalization and politicization of the armed groups, which we saw in Cote d'Ivoire. And then on the other side, where we've seen community-based armed groups, instead of integrating that community perspective into the armed forces, can actually be captured locally as well, where you see community-based armed groups again engaging in more coercive forms of violence as traditional leaders manipulate local police forces or local military forces in order to engage in localized conflict or suppress local groups. So that's just some of the assumptions that I think have been made about community-based armed groups and how our own interventions have played into that coercive, negotiated dynamic of violence.
Wonderful. Thank you, Lauren, for those insights. Before I turn it over to Kamina to weigh in, I just wanted to remind everyone in the audience that if you have any questions as we're talking, please use the Q&A function or drop them in the chat, depending on which platform you're on, because we will be taking audience questions in a bit. So Kamina, do you want to let us know what you think?
Yes, of course. Thank you very much, Lauren. I totally agree with what you said. Do we need these approaches? I think the problem in Côte d'Ivoire is the fact that there were no specific programs. They didn't approach those groups specifically. They approached them as a whole. And they did the same for the women, because the DDR was not gender sensitive. It was gender blind. Even if they say in some text that DDR process was gender sensitive, when you ask women and when you just observe what has been done during the DDR process, it was gender blind. And the fact that we approach all those layers of groups the same way has huge consequences on the post-conflict era, because you can't approach a civilian who have never who joined the group for material reasons or even security during a particular time frame, as you approach someone as a dozo who, even before the crisis, was involved in the security sector. So you can't, it's difficult to expect from them that after the crisis, they will just go back to their former activities, because most of the time their former activities was in the security sector. It just evolved during the crisis. Even if it wasn't their main activities, during the crisis, this security aspect was emphasized, and it was giving them some financial security, legally and other criminal activities. So basically what I can say is that it's really important to as Resolve is doing, it's really important to try to get more information about the context, about what are the different groups we are trying to demobilize, why do they join the groups, it's really important, what were their activities during the crisis, but maybe, and most importantly, what were they doing before the crisis. And I think it's a point that most of the time we don't emphasize. We want to know what the groups and what they were doing during the crisis. But if you want a good, I guess, a reintegration program, I believe it's really important to know what they were doing before the crisis, because this before can explain also in which activity you can reintegrate them well. And you can also interrogate why they stop their activities to join an armed groups, and so I believe it's really important to really try to understand what is the context, the local context, and even in Côte d'Ivoire, it's different. What happened in the north is really different from what happened in the south. Is even more different from what happened in the west, where there were also multiple groups. So it needs time. It needs micro-level analysis, and it needs also a long-term perspective before the crisis, and also a prospective analysis. Thank you.
Thank you, Camina, and I absolutely agree with you. So the DDR literature does talk a lot about the fact that we do need to tailor these programs to individuals, and not just the skills or what they were doing before, but also their aspirations. So is that actually what they want to be doing? And so I guess I was wondering, what can we take from violent extremist disengagement reintegration programs or DDR approaches, ideology? Because with violent extremist groups, for a lot of individuals, not all, but you do have an ideology that's motivating involvement, and you see that also in some cases of DDR. So, it seems in these cases, how can we help individuals make that transition through programming? And also thinking a little bit about what you were mentioning, Camina, what role does stigma play, right, in their reintegration? I imagine the stigma will vary across those CBAGs, based on what they did, while active.
Yes, indeed. I've been working on the question of the stigma more for women than for the DOSO, but it was a real point, a real matter, because the fact that they are based within the community is central. Most of the time, before, during, and after the crisis, they were just all living together, but the power changed at a certain point during the crisis, because they have weapons, they are more power than civilians, and after the crisis they were supposed at least to get back to their to the same actually social status, and this is also a reason why some of them disengage to them, because there were also protection needs. Why I try to be really quick on that point, but I try to make comparison between the three cities I've been working on, Abidjan, Bouaké, and Korogo, and I've been working with 3 different associations of DOSO between those different locations. And what I've been observing is depending on the location, depending on the needs, the relation between the DOSO association and the states is totally different. In Korogo, for instance, you are in the north of the country. It's there are less police officers, less security apparatus from the states, and there is a real need from the community to get protected. So there is a huge. The DOSO have a huge headquarters, which has been financed by politicians during the crisis, Laurent Gbagbo and so on, like really big top politicians. And now sometimes they were doing meetings with the states, members of the states, regarding the security of the area. It's really different from Abidjan, where the DOSO are playing another cards, and they can't, because there is the police officer and because we are in urban cities, we can't expect from DOSO, who have traditional weapons, for instance, to patrol in the streets. While in Korogo, in some rural area, the DOSO are the only providers of security.
Great. Lauren, do you want to weigh in?
Yeah, thank you, Mary Beth. And Camina, this is a great discussion. A little bit the idea of stigmatization and some of the work we're trying to do at NDI with a terrific organization, Beyond Conflict. And this idea of stigmatization, I think, is really important, and that a deeper analysis of stigmatization should really inform our interventions around individuals and around community-based armed groups themselves. And I think one of the things that we're beginning to realize is that there's various levels of stigmatization, and that should really inform how you engage and how your programming should engage. If we think of stigmatization, there's a continuum. There might be stigmatization that is simply misperceptions about the other group, right? Members of community-based armed groups are always violent, right? Or, they're, antisocial. We might have another category of stigmatization that others, community-based armed groups, that they are not of us, they are different, and they are a threat, and they must be dealt with in that way. And then there's the more problematic, which we've always heard, about individuals, community-based armed groups members that are trying to integrate, that they are that they're microbes or they're particles or they're this dehumanization of community-based armed groups. And I think really paying attention to stigmatization, a misperception might just be bringing groups together. Othering requires greater and more, dialogue, intergroup dialogue, and then this idea around dehumanization really means that we need to be thinking about security protections, et cetera, monitoring violence, and those types of movements. So I think this area of stigmatization is really important and really needs to be a critical part of our analysis. The last thing I want to say on programmatic interventions, Kamina, which is that I think it was threaded through all of your discussion around the different interventions, but I would really like to pull it out in the sense that we often think of engaging members of community-based armed groups in jobs programs or in social reconciliation programs, right? But we really don't think of this in terms of a governance approach or a democracy and governance approach that often members, and Mary Beth, this is what we pick up from sort of some of the VEDR thinking, right? That really, members of armed groups can have legitimate grievances. They can have grievances about state predation, state abandonment, state exclusion, et cetera. But that armed groups are sort of the only avenue they might have available to engage that grievance. And so I would really hope that we, see a lot more in terms of what I would call governance engagement of community-based armed groups members and groups themselves. And Kamina, your third group was doing that, right? They had become advocates, engaging the state. So that's a governance role. They had become, turn their grievances into nonviolent approaches to the state. Civic education, I think, is another thing. Teaching community-based armed groups how they can engage governments to change and advocate for legitimacy. Election monitors, right? How do they engage them in, pro-governance groups that are helping to, improve community security? I'll leave it at that. It's just that the only thing I will say is that I also think there's a missing middle in governance, that we often, when we talk about DDR, we focus on state structures and how we can reform security sector institutions so that they're less predatory, more responsive to citizens. And we focus at the local level, right, on how do we help community-based armed group members renegotiate their identities with the community. But there's this all-important missing middle in governance. These are the traditional leaders that help governments translate, governance norms down to communities. These are civil servants who are trained in helping communities move past violence. And I think community-based armed groups that often navigate that terrain between the state and communities can play powerful governance roles in reestablishing those connections between the state and the community. So just in terms of programming, really thinking more about that third pillar of governance in addition to economic and social reforms.
Great, thank you, Lauren. And that was one of the things that I was thinking, as you were speaking is, in weak, the DDR literature does tell us, like, typically we need a certain threshold, of political stability, of democracy, of these sorts of things. And so I guess I'm wondering, in weak security environments or in weak governance environments, are certain CBAGs worth not disengaging, if they are serving a hybrid governance role? Obviously, some would want to disengage, but those ones that are serving somewhat of a positive role. So I see, like, on the one hand, they challenge the state's monopoly on the legitimate use of force, but they are, serving a public good. Any thoughts on that, Kamina or Lauren?
You can go on.
No, I think, Mary Beth, that's really important. I think that CBAGs come out of, they are not just security actors in their communities. As Kamina's described with hunter groups, they provide really important political social norms at the local level on how communities interact with each other, how justice is served. We have seen, CBAG groups rooted in important community social and political transitions from youth to adulthood and what it means to be an adult and a responsible member of the community. We have seen members of community-based armed groups move in and out. We see this at NDI all the time, of political parties and social movements on the ground and really advocating for political transformation and change. And I think that if I talked earlier about like assumptions that we make about community-based armed groups, I think that's one of the assumptions that we really have to quickly move past. That unlike violent extremist groups and rebel groups that seek to overthrow the state or undermine the state, community-based armed groups have often members played important roles in seeking to transform and reform or shore up, governance. And I think that's one of the important avenues for exploration for the transition of both CBAG individuals and groups.
Great, thank you.
I do agree they don't only have this security purpose, and for instance, one of the association I'm working with in Côte d'Ivoire, as I said, they are not able to really focus on this security aspect because the police is here and there is a whole apparatus, state apparatus that cannot be really overthrown. But what they are doing is that they are focusing on the cultural side of the dozo. As I said, the dozo are traditional hunters, and so they convey a message of developmentalist discourse to protect the nature, to protect the forest, and because the nature is underarmed, and they create NGOs to protect the nature and to focus more on this aspect. But globally, they try to survive with different strategy within the state apparatus. Some of them have the ability to focus on security purpose, and others, I think, are using other domain to maintain themselves within the era of the state.
Great. Okay, I'm going to move to some questions. We have some questions coming in from the audience. So, all right. So there seem to be some examples of attempts to reintegrate former terrorists or violent extremists that can have negative security consequences. So, for example, in Afghanistan, is this also a concern for CBAG? So, thinking about whether you send these individuals out into the community. That I think, Kamina, you mentioned a little bit about individuals.
Yes, I'm not working on terrorism, so I really can't.
No, but for CBAG.
Yes, most of them, what I've seen is that some of them try to. They didn't. The case of Côte d'Ivoire is really special, so that's why sometimes it's a little bit tricky, even when we are talking about CBAGs, because they have this. An important role even before the crisis in the security, and so they joined the crisis. Some of them joined it, and after they tried to maintain in the security sector. So yes, it's a concern even for CBAG that some of them after their disengagement try to go back within the group for many reasons. It can be financial, it can be normative, it can be also. For security purpose as well. How to mitigate that? it's a really good question. I guess by doing, if we want to keep the DDR, take the DDR approach within this framework, I think it's, as I said before, we really need to be more contextual, to be more precise, and to have more knowledge about those groups, to understand what do they, to understand their aspirations. And when I was talking about the long-term perspective, it's because of that. Sometimes the programs end after 2 or 3 years, or even 6 months. We need to go back. It needs money, it needs everything, but we need to go back sometimes 2 years, 3 years, 10 years later to understand what happened, to evaluate and to monitor what happened. And I think that is always missing. And if we don't do that, I mean, some researchers are doing that, but if it's not at a state level, level, it's going to be really complicated to understand why they decide to re-engage and to mitigate this kind of re-engagement.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. So, and the DDR literature talks a lot about that, right? So you have your sort of one-off programming, but DDR should be viewed as sort of part of this larger political process, right? And so even if, your programming is successful in the sense that they're offering, financial incentives and other things, if those structural issues are still there and those grievances are what's motivating involvement in the CBAG, or security provision for the community is still not good, then we will see individuals going back to those groups. Lauren, did you want to weigh in on this question?
No, I'll just add to what you and Camina, Mary Beth are talking about, this idea that, these are actually, in many ways, political negotiations. DDR is a political negotiation. Community-based armed groups members can return. And so I think one of the important aspects of that is that the community itself needs to feel that its security needs are being met, either through national level security sector reform, or, and it's something that has not come up yet in this discussion, the need for local accountability for the violence that was perpetrated. If the community does not feel secure with these, former combatants entering the community, then CBAGs will never be demobilized, right? Effectively, the community will remobilize, or they will encourage, them not to go away or play other roles. And then, Meredith, I think the other thing, it was a great question about Afghanistan as well, which is that I think, and this gets to Camina's long term, there's a political, structural, institutional negotiations that go on. But, community-based armed groups have been in these communities for generations. And so, and as part of that process, there has always been a community negotiation around the behaviors and social norms around violence, and what these, community-based armed groups can and cannot do within the context of the community. I think it's a great discussion around Afghanistan, because sometimes, these transitions are started when these mechanisms, community mechanisms that were used to engage community-based armed groups have broken down, they're non-existent. So we're bringing these political security actors back into, a vacuum, a political and social, where coercive violence is the possibility. So it's just as important for us to focus on the institutional, behavioral, and normative, institutions that exist in the community, as much as we are focused on, as Camina had, the individual, because that's what's going to determine successful reintegration.
If I may, I just would like to add one point, is that the re-engagement of some of them is also due to new threats. because, for instance, terrorism wasn't a question before, 2014, 2015 in Côte d'Ivoire. And there was this maybe 2 or 3 years during which it was really the post-crisis consequences. But after that, after the attacks in Bassam, where the terrorist attack in Bassam, the communities were facing new threats, and there were new needs for security that the state wasn't able to give in every area of the country. That's also a reason why some groups re-engage to protect the community, because there were these new needs.
Have you ever seen a backlash to efforts to to disengage these community-based armed groups? I'm just thinking, I study the IRA a bit, and when they were going through their ceasefires, there really was worry in the community, like who's going to protect us? Do you see that? Do you see sort of from the community this worry or like backlash against the disengagement of those groups?
Not really for my case, but because once again it's layers of actors, and but it's really different. I can't talk for the whole Côte d'Ivoire because I've not been working on all CBAGs. For Abidjan, for instance, they were seeing the DOZO and the CBAGs sometimes more as a threats for some parts of the population at least. But when you go to the north, it really depends on the groups. Sometimes there have been so many violations, so many criminal activities during the war and even after the war made by those CBAGs that they are not really seeing them as a protectors, but as a threat. That it really depends on the part of the country, on the groups. And that's the reason why I've been working quickly on the bureaucratization, because the DOZO, they have clothes, traditional clothes. They have their traditional weapons as well. But what happened even before the crisis is that some criminals just were able to buy those clothes in the market, and they were going to do some criminal activities. So they were issuing cards, official cards from the association with stamps, with the footprints, and they were sending the cards to make sure that when police officers were controlling those DOZO, we were patrolling with them sometimes, they were able to show an official cards. So it was a way to tackle those issues.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Okay. Lauren, any thoughts on this, or?
Yeah, and I think, Mary Beth, this is actually an important point, which I think is important to note, in this discussion, which is that, yes, I think there's backlash, and as Camina said, a heightened sense of a threat in the community. As CBAGs, because of this deteriorating security environment, form alliances with the state or are captured by the state, or for alliances with insurgent groups. And so then sort of their rootedness in community values, CBAGs, perceptions and actions around the use of violence, around, what is, inappropriate threat changes, okay? And I think that is where we see sort of, the most, community backlash or nervousness around this. So I'm thinking in the sense where, we've seen community-based armed groups, ethnic groups in Mali aligning with violent extremist groups, often against the wishes of members of their own ethnic groups that don't want to see the politicization and of their own existence, locally. And CBAGs have committed atrocities against those members of their own community, right? And so then you see as well, you know, in Burkina Faso and in Nigeria, the capture of community-based armed groups by the state apparatus, you know, in the midst of insurgencies. So you see community-based armed groups becoming intelligence gatherers. Well, that, you know, for community members is a nervous function for these. Who are they reporting on? Who are they accountable to? Who authorizes and governs their activities in the community going forward, and who their allegiances to? The same with you know community-based armed groups that have been in some ways captured in whole by Nigerian governors. And who are no longer sort of connected to community norms. So, and the reason I raise this is because more and more this is the norm, that community-based armed groups are being captured by state and other insurgent group interests. And so I think you're going to see more and more of these cases where they are detached from communities, from their norms, from their interests for longer periods of time. And I think then the reintegration of community-based armed groups, either as groups or individually, becomes much more problematic.
Yeah, that was a very disheartening comments there. So I guess I'm wondering, Lauren, just to push you a little further, like in those contexts, what can be done? It seems like when you have sort of a predatory state, exploiting these groups, does it have to be a massive political regime change? What can you do in those contexts? I mean, it doesn't seem like you could disengage. Maybe you could disengage, and that was a question I had. Is this always a collective process? Maybe you could disengage individuals from those groups, but it seems like a very difficult situation.
Well, Mary Beth and Karina, this is where I would love your perspective as well, because we've been talking about DDR at the back end, right? After things have started to break down, and I've been thinking a little bit more about could we set up mechanisms and institutions at the front end? If we are understanding that states in these moments of tremendous insecurity as violence rises, who are tapping into these localized actors, if we know that's what they're doing, right, could we not put in place could not our, engagement with security sector actors, which is almost more formal, right? Military to armed forces, right? Could we not start to engage on this issue, right? Do we put in place mechanisms around the deputization of community-based armed groups into formal, security actors? Do we put in place monitoring mechanisms? Do we, insist that they also receive, not that it has been entirely or even remotely effective, but, human rights training? Do we begin to accept that this is, a formal arrangement with informal actors and begin to encourage more protections and professionalism around these in order to, assist with the transition after?
So you're talking about training, professionalization of those groups, or?
Yeah, I'm talking about, if that's the assumption, then why are we not engaging in our security sector, training, which we do a lot of with these communities? And how do we encourage, official military actors to help professionalize those relationships? How, if this is going to happen, how do we teach governors in Nigeria what appropriate civil military control of our, armed actors is, even in the informal sector? And most importantly, how do we train civil society organizations on the important role they have in monitoring the operations of security forces in their communities? So
Yeah, I think those are all really important points. I guess my mind, kind of goes to, if the state military, is not, engaging in, protecting human rights and those sorts of things, it's really hard to then, engage with them in training of the CBAG. So I just know cases where like the U.S. is offering military assistance, but it's just really hard to, have compliance on human rights issues and those sorts of things. And I imagine in my mind that those are the contexts where they're kind of picking up these CBAGs, to use them. And then I guess another thing I kind of think of is, in the violent extremism literature, a lot of times the state will ally with these groups because they want to distance themselves, right? And they can engage in all the dirty, nasty violence. They can say, well, it wasn't me, it was the CBAG, right? So they do have sometimes an incentive not to train those forces to be professional, right? They're kind of using them in that sense. Mina, did you want to add anything or?
Yes, I think it's interesting, but even in Côte d'Ivoire, there were this question of officializing those DOZO association, but they didn't went really far on this question because, as Marybeth said, it's too dangerous for them. There are so many different agendas. I think it's complicated and it's too risky for them. Mainly because it's still a polarized society. So it's really complicated to embrace the DOZO. We were fighting for one side, and to train them officially and to make them part of the official apparatus. I guess it's one of the reasons because. They still have difficulties to control the army. That's why I was talking about the mutiny. The security sector isn't stable, and so it's really complicated, I guess, to went further with those CBAGs groups.
All right, so there's this great question that's been lingering here in the chat that I'm dying to ask from the audience, and I think it's a very important question. So, we've talked a lot about the importance of if we can have them political settlements or peace processes, and this being part of that larger process. And the question from the audience is, how should CBAGs be included or consulted in peace processes where these programs are negotiated? So, when should we include CBAGs in those negotiations? And I guess I would push you to think about what kinds of CBAGs should be included. So some of them may be positive actors, some of them may be negative actors. Although I would add that negative actors, if they're not included, could be, potential spoilers of that peace process.
I would say it's better to include everyone to the table of discussion, but theoretically it's easy to say, easier said than done. But yes, it's crucial, as it's important to have women on the table. It's crucial to try at least to have those actors, because as I mentioned, within the rebellion there were those DOZO, but once the DDR process started, DOZO and rebels were considered as the same, and it's tricky effectively because all those layers of identities are really hard to distinguish. But it is important for the international community, for CSOs, actors and stuff to really make this work, to make sure that, okay, a DOZO, while is both a rebel and a DOZO, can really talk about these points, because they probably don't have the same perspective as other groups. As a woman don't have the same perspective as a male counterparts. It's really important to make sure that they are trying to do that even with terrorist groups, but it's way more complicated. But I've seen in Mali, for instance, they were trying to do that.
Great. Lauren, do you have any thoughts on this?
I do have some thoughts on this. I think it's a great question, especially Marybeth, your idea of spoilers versus positive members. And I remember in the research I did on, how to typologize different community-based armed groups, one of the more interesting approaches that I ran across, and I think it's useful for this discussion, was in Sierra Leone, where there was actually a pre-negotiation phase with these community-based armed groups, where civil society members went into, wherever these community-based armed groups were engaged, and sat down and said, before we even get to the negotiation table, what is it going to take, for you to reintegrate effectively? What are your motivations for being in these community-based armed groups? What are you fighting for? How could that be transitioned into, civilian life? And I thought, so my answer to that is, that, Mary Beth, does two things. Number one, it in many ways creates the parameters for the local peace negotiation, right? Because what is it going to take for armed actors to lay down their arms, right? And I don't think we do that. We do it at the national level with insurgent, groups, what is it going to take? But I don't think we do it at the local level. There's sort of this assumption that a local peace process is all it takes. So there's not this but I think it also gets at the issue of programming, right? What is it going to take in terms of programming to make the peace processes effective and implementable after? So I would throw that out.
Great, thank you. There's a question from the audience about stigma and whether or not, so that came up as a potential barrier to reintegration. And I know, Lauren, you mentioned that that's something you're focusing on right now. And I know it's something I'm actually working on in the violent extremism world. Do you see that as something that's, or do you see social cohesion programs as something that might be useful in combating that stigma, or?
Yes. Absolutely. And Camina, I'll probably mostly turn this over to you because you were the one that mentioned, the importance of stigmatization. But yes, this again gets back to the idea that, community-based armed groups are for and of the community and cannot successfully reintegrate unless the community is engaged in, social cohesion efforts around conflict dynamics. Is exactly like Camina said, if those aren't resolved, community-based armed groups will not go away. Social cohesion around stigmatization and reintegrating community-based armed groups back in. If they're not reintegrated back in, they become coercive actors, gangs, vigilante groups. So I think these social cohesion projects are absolutely essential. However, I don't think we know enough about what social cohesion projects work in these particular contexts. What does build trust, in terms of community actives and what doesn't. And so that, I think, is where the biggest gap is to me. Yes, on social cohesion, but I don't think we know enough yet. And so we tend to throw the same programs at the same conflict problems.
Yeah, I absolutely agree that we don't know what works, and that programs may be better suited for, in certain contexts where maybe you have a certain threshold of security. It's very hard to ask people to try and get along when they're, worried that their neighbor may kill them. So I think there needs to be a certain threshold of security before we start thinking about, building social cohesion.
And working a little bit about that regarding women reintegration, because what is really interesting about the rebellion, for instance, from the north of Côte d'Ivoire, is that some young people integrate the groups because their family, for instance, their father and their mother and as well, they were asking them to join the group. But after that, it had consequences on their life, because some of them, for the case of Côte d'Ivoire, for instance, the war was really short. Finally, the violence, the period of violence, it was more status quo for many years than really war, as we can talk, as we can see for the Second World War, for instance, and so on. So they stay in the community. Sometimes the community push them to join the group. After that, because of sometimes they have looted, or sometimes they had criminal activities, or sometimes just because they were in armed groups, their status changed within the community, and sometimes it's really hard for them to deal with those different identities finally, because they stayed within their community. They are the children of these communities. They joined the group to protect their communities, and at the end, sometimes the community reject them because it's really because, yes, they reject them, but at the same time they were asking for them to join the groups. So as Laurent said, it's really, I think it's a gray zone, and there is a need for really more deep research on that with a social perspective to understand what is happening to them, and it's really important to join to work with the community as well. There is a huge work to do with the community to understand why they are also acted like that with their counterparts from CBAGs.
Yeah, those are really interesting points, Camina. I think in the DDR literature, they talk a lot about the fact, if you can have some community-based projects, as well as, information campaigns that explain, even though this person joined this group, they're not responsible for all the group's activities, or in many cases, individuals were forced to join a group. So trying to inform the community a little bit can help. Not that it can completely eliminate stigma, but that it can help. All right, so I want to end on a positive note here. So there's a question from the audience: how can CBAGs more effectively use their skills to serve communities and better support peace building? So I think we're talking about the positive CBAGs here, but how can they, help with these societal transformations? We keep talking about large structural transformations. Is it possible for them to be avenues for change in these societies? I don't know who wants to take that one. Lauren, do you want to start?
I guess we're not a very positive group, but no, that's not true. Well, I think I would like to see us, again, on the governance angle, think of more positive governance roles that we could imagine for community-based armed groups to play. So, for example, there's often a huge gap in, for example, disaster response and disaster relief, right? In that, the state can't get to many of these more remote communities. Could we think of ways that community-based armed groups could play roles in disaster response and disaster relief that satisfy for those that play that more negotiated role in terms of violence, that satisfy their needs of service, take advantage of the skills they have. But this is where I really would like to think about, in terms of community-based armed groups, and then how can we help community-based armed groups connect local communities to the state, right, in more positive, transformative ways. Election observers, so transforming community-based armed groups into other types of security networks. That's how I think, again, in terms of more governance functions. The last I'll say is that, we've been doing some work in terms of civil society groups, looking to engage community-based armed groups in Libya in making the transition to civil society. So again, moving towards their need for advocacy and their need for transformation, but putting it in a more nonviolent place.
Mina, do you want to have the last word? Oh, I think you may be muted. There you go.
Yes, really quick. I think they have indeed multiple roles, and even in the security sector, they are important actors still in Côte d'Ivoire. And as I said, with those new threats as terrorism, it's important to be, as I said, also trying to work on different domain, even on the protect the nature, protect the forest, protect us from the climate change. So they are really smart actors, and it's important for us to understand them well to make sure that we will stay protected.
Great, thank you. And so I think there are some commonalities in our discussion across the DDR and the violent extremism literature, just in the fact that we need to really carefully consider the context that these groups are operating in, the larger political structures, as well as the individuals involved in these groups. What are their motivations? What are their histories? What are their aspirations? So with that, I'm going to turn it over to the Resolve Director, Alistair Reid, to wrap us up. Thank you, though.
Great. Thank you very much to all of our speakers today, and thank you, all of you, for joining us. This has been a really fascinating, engaging discussion, which has given us much food for thought. And it's been a great conclusion to this phase of our CBAGs project. Please do visit our website to explore our past CBAGs publication. There's a rich library of research there, but also watch out for our latest publications coming out in the next few weeks. We hope to build on our research on CBAGs in the future by further investigating disengagement and reconciliation of CBAGs, as well as to explore their formation activities in different regions across the world. Finally, today's event was the first in our annual Global Forum series of events, so please do keep an eye on our website and social media for information on the next events in this series happening over the coming months. Thank you, and I hope you all have a good day.